Good evening. I'm Michael Dawson. I'm director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and a professor of political science at the university. This event is one of a number that the center is conducting as part of our continuing 20th anniversary celebration. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Pap NDiaye of Sciences Po. I've known Professor NDiaye for a number of years and have been grateful for his insightful scholarly analysis, as well as the warm welcome he provided when I was teaching in Paris a few years ago. We met at an academic conference on reparations several years ago at the University of Virginia, and publicly continued that discussion at an event co-sponsored by the UFC and Sciences Po in Paris a few years ago. We also continued the discussion today at lunch. This is a critical time for all of us, as racial animosities and conflicts have poisoned politics in Europe, including countries such as Hungary, I would argue the United Kingdom, and many others. Here in the United States, we have just experienced a traumatic election that saw the open mobilization of racial hatred and the most racially polarized politics that we have seen for at least half a century. A central question these racialized politics have raised is who are the legitimate members of political communities in various countries. In both France and the US, questions are raised about whether immigrants, blacks, or Muslims, for example, can or should be full members of the political community. We are lucky to have Professor NDiaye here to share his analysis of racial politics that are shaping French politics, as well as the politics of other European and North American countries. He's a historian specializing in the social history of the United States with a focus on its minorities. He holds a doctorate from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, where he was a lecturer before being selected in 2012 as professor of the Institut d'études Politiques de Paris, Sciences Po. He's a member of the Center for North American Studies and the editorial board of the journal History. From 1991 to 1996, he studied in the United States, where he wrote his thesis on the petrochemical company DuPont. On his return to France, he was appointed a lecturer at the ES. His publications include Nylon and Bombs, DuPont and the March of Modern America, American Democracy in the 20th Century, Les Lois Américaines, A Marche pour l'Égalité, and Histoire de Chicago, co-written with Andrew Diamond. He is a pioneer of Black studies in France. He founded the Circle of Action for the Promotion of Diversity in France with Patrick Lousset. He is currently working on a global history of civil rights in the 20th century. I would like to thank our sponsors, which include CSRPC, the French Chicago Center, the Franke Institute for Humanities, the French Club, the Cultural Services at the Consulate of France in Chicago, and the Alliance Française. The Consulate has energetically made it possible for these talks to occur, and they have our special thanks. I also thank Associate Director Tracy Matthews and Program Director Darrell Effian for the massive amount of work they've done, without which this event, or for that matter any other event at this center, would be possible. Tonight's lecture is part of the Marianne Midwest series and is being streamed live to satellite audiences in 12 different university and or Alliance Française communities located throughout the Midwest, including Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Detroit, Columbus, Kansas City, Omaha, Bloomington, and Grand Rapids, to name a few. At the conclusion of Professor NDiaye's remarks, we'll have time for questions from both the audience here in Chicago and for questions submitted by our virtual audience members throughout the Midwest. We had a great discussion and lecture at lunchtime when Professor NDiaye discussed the French debate on reparations for slavery and offered a pragmatic approach. I know we'll have a dynamic discussion tonight as well. The title of tonight's lecture is The Minority Paradox, Blackness in France. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor NDiaye.
Thank you very much, Professor Dawson. It's a real honor and a pleasure for me to speak at the University of Chicago and also to be in connection with people watching the video. So I also say hello not only to everyone here, but also to other people elsewhere on different campuses. It is an honor and also a pleasure, and I want to wholeheartedly thank Professor Dawson, the cultural services of the French Embassy, as well as the French Consulate in Chicago for having organized this conference. It is the title, this conversation on race in France. I did not expect to speak after the election we've been getting through. This comes as a surprise, but after thinking about that, I reached the conclusion that it is all the more a necessity that we need to the academic work as well as a work that has some connection with society to go on, especially during the times and in the next few months when we are struggling in France as well as in many other countries with this powerful wave of xenophobic populism. Last July, in a police station located in the working class suburbs of Paris, where strong uprisings took place in 2005, a 24-year-old black man named Adama Traoré died of natural causes, as the police stated. The Traoré family protested and asked for a full inquiry regarding the causes of the death. We soon learned that Traoré died in this police station because he couldn't breathe. His neck and chest were crushed by 3 policemen standing on him. A few days later, a demonstration took place in Paris with hundreds of protesters, almost all black, all asking for the truth. A movement, Black Lives Matter France, was created. In other words, the American situation, far from being totally foreign to many French persons, has often been a window, a mirror through which to question French society and politics. Of course, BLM France is much smaller and marginal than BLM US, not only in demographic terms, but also politically speaking. Anti-racism in France has been struggling for 40 years, facing an aggressive rightist opposition, denouncing more and more anti-racism as worse than racism, and the lack of mobilization in the general population. At that point, I was ready to draw a sharp contrast with the US situation, but now I have to say that the election of Trump shows that similar issues take place in the United States, which does not mean, of course, that movements such as BLM USA is not stronger than that of its French equivalent. Many observers of French social and political life seem to have recently discovered the existence of black populations in metropolitan France. On an individual level, these people may be visible, but as a social group and as a cognitive category, French blacks don't have much of an existence for social scientists as well as policymakers. Sometimes they have been called invisible men and women. As a group, they don't have any existence since the French Republic does not officially recognize ethno-racial minorities and has defined itself as colorblind with no racial bias. This situation would not be problematic if the social problems encountered by French blacks were acknowledged and analyzed. As I will argue, this is not the case. On the academic level, the situation is rather similar. In France, there are more books and articles published on African Americans than on African French or Caribbean French people. Indeed, African American history is a well-established field in France. By contrast, studies on African immigrants, African students, Guadeloupean civil servants, etc. Are scarce, and there's practically nothing, although things have been coming out for some years now, on French blacks, as if this racial figuration had no legitimacy or meaning to describe past and contemporary social situation. However, fairly recent French developments since 2005, sometimes called the Black question by journalists, have raised a number of issues related to blacks in France, their history, their socioeconomic situation, the discriminations they may face in their everyday life, etc. These issues have long been marginal and even illegitimate in the French academia. Clearly, the French Republican ideology has moved on the side questions which were seen as threatening the national cohesion. But the question is, why have French scholars who are trained to analyze and denounce inequalities and situations of domination been blind to blacks and, I would argue, to race as an analytical category? As I'm arguing, I think that most French blacks, or a sizable portion of this population, as most other minorities, seek to be both visible and invisible. Invisible from a social standpoint, invisible for the police, for example, but visible from a cultural standpoint. The French situation might be more that of visibility vis-à-vis the police and invisibility in many cultural issues. That is why I call this the minority paradox. When I started to work on French blacks a few years after coming back from the United States, so that is why so many usually scholars in France who work on these issues, racial issues, have often been spending time in the United States, some years in the United States. This is always an accusation of being too Americanized, right? This idea of projecting American realities onto a French situation that would be essentially different. But when I started to work on that, on French blacks, quote unquote, a theoretical and a political problem soon arose. Is there such a group as French blacks? There are obvious cultural differences between persons coming from the French Guyana, the French Caribbean island, the Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar, West African countries such as Senegal, Mali, Niger, Mauritania, as well as Central African countries such as Gabon and Congo, etc. The diversity of this group is certainly wider than that of blacks in the United States, even if sizable groups of Caribbean and African migrants have settled in the United States since the 1920s, where the black population is more diverse than ever. In a nutshell, the population of African descent in metropolitan France remained small up to the First World War. A few thousand people at most, that is about the same number as in the late 18th century. Slavery in the 18th century was officially forbidden in metropolitan France. Slaves who arrived to a metropole often demanded their freedom, which led to complicated legal processes. The first turning point occurred during the First World War, when 100,000 Senegalese tirailleurs, African soldiers, arrived in France, followed by 100,000 African American soldiers. Several thousands of these soldiers chose to settle in France, metropolitan France, after the armistice, in spite of the French authorities, which wanted colonial soldiers to return to the colonies. A mixed population of persons from Africa and the Caribbean grew in the interwar period. My calculation is that we're talking about 30,000 people at most, at a time when blacks were not only a matter of colonial discourses, but became a fairly banal social fact in Paris, Marseille, or Bordeaux. A second turning point occurred in the early 1960s with the massive arrival of African and Caribbean workers. African migrants, almost all males from the valley of the Senegal River, came to work in various heavy industries such as the automobile industry, encouraged by agreements signed between the French government and the new African governments. France had its own Great Migration, right, within the French Empire, although within the former French Empire in the 1960s and in the early 1970s. By contrast, the migrants who came from the overseas department, from the Caribbean, had a migration organized by an official agency, the UMIDOM, and were employed in the lower ranks of the civil service and came with their families. We can estimate this population to 500,000 people by the mid-1970s. In 1974, the French government decided to close the French borders to non-European migrants, African migrants who couldn't come back to their native countries and be replaced by family siblings, as it was customary before, decided to stay in France. They didn't have much choice if they wanted to send money to their families. The last important moment started in the early 1980s with the arrival of African women and children, thanks to a new policy of family reunion under the socialist government, which significantly increased the African population in France. Also, in the 1990s, in the years 2000, newcomers from Central Africa, Madagascar, and the Ivory Coast seeking asylum in France have contributed to the diversification of African populations beyond the original Western African groups. So again, I'm getting back to the question I was raising earlier. How can we, given this diversity, speak of blacks in general? Well, the question has been dealt throughout the 20th century by numerous movements, by writers, by novelists, by social scientists, and so on and so forth. France first has had a history of black movements and organizations in France which should be studied in comparative and transnational perspectives. Indeed, French activists, whether in the colonial times or in the post-colonial period, understood their activism as part of a larger perspective, using the foreign experience as a vantage point to fight discrimination and racism. The numerous associations noires in the 1920s and 30s in France have been studied. The first Pan-African Congress held in Paris in 1919 with Blaise Diagne and W.E.B. Du Bois has been studied. The Universal League for the Defense of the Black Race, founded by René Maran and Kojo Tuvalu, the Committee for the Defense of Blacks, created by Lamine Senghor and Kouyaté in 1925, followed by various associations. All these organizations were closely associated in the 1920s, early 30s, to the Communist Party, which encouraged their activities in the name of anti-colonialism, while controlling their activities by fear of an autonomization which would have threatened the unity of the proletarian class. You may know that the Third International, the Communist International, whose headquarters, of course, were in Moscow, had a black section, headquarters in Hamburg, Germany, until 1933. George Padmore was one of the most active communists in this black section at that time, before moving to Paris. But the CP and its associated trade union in France, as well as the Ministère des Colonies and its police unit, efficiently undermined this organization effort in the mid-1930s. It's interesting to look, if you're interested in these issues, at the archives of the Minister of Colonies in Paris, which the Minister of Colonies had a special police unit in charge of following the African and Caribbean activists in metropolitan France at that time. So you have all the police reports of these activities. In the mid-1930s, the difficulties encountered by black workers' organizations led to the emergence of a more elitist intellectual and cultural movement, the Négritude. The Négritude was never formally organized. It remained a loose association of young intellectuals and poets, including Césaire, Senghor, and Damas, three well-known poets who never tried to organize a grassroots effort. However, the Négritude had interest in political and cultural development up to the end of the decolonization process in the early 1960s. In its early development, the Négritude had a strong cultural dimension. It was first and foremost a way to celebrate African cultures ridiculed by the colonial exhibit of 1931 and other displays of colonial paternalism. A way also to fight the theories of assimilation, stating that blacks would enter civilization only by adopting European cultures and ways of living. Les Noirs évoluaient as the civilized blacks, as they were called in the 1930s. Senghor writes later, much later, I was then, between 1932 and 1935, with other black students, in Paris, he's talking about Paris, in a kind of hopeless panic. Future seemed gloomy. Sounds like interesting. But today, what if? No reform in view, and the colonizers legitimated our political and economic dependence by our cultural inferiority. In order to create an effective revolution, we had to get rid of our borrowed clothes, les vêtements d'emprunt, our borrowed clothes, those of the assimilation, and reaffirm ourself, that is our Négritude, end quote. The Négritude, as we also know, was also deeply linked to the writers of the Harlem Renaissance. Senghor and Césaire were acute readers of Alain Locke, of Langston Hughes. They were perfectly aware also of this beautiful novel, which I always recommend to my students in Paris, Benjo by Claude Maquet, which is a wonderful description of Marseille in the mid-1920s. For students, for the French, who usually think of Marseille through the eyes and through the writing of Pagnol, with its kind of folkloric understanding of Marseille, reading Benjo is a much more interesting understanding of the social and ethnic dynamics taking place in this city at that time. Maquet spent time on the Mediterranean coast, including in Marseille. To Senghor, to Césaire, and to Damas, the Négritude movement was not a way to discard universalism, but a way to say that keeping their cultures was a condition to universalism, as Sartre understood very well. Césaire used to say, I want to learn Latin and ancient Greek, but I also want to understand what my grandmother is telling me. His grandmother, of course, was speaking Creole. She was not speaking in French. The same would be true for Senghor. In spite of their common philosophical and political ground, two major currents can be analyzed within the Négritude movement. I don't want to make too strong a separation, but let's say that the first approach, embodied by Senghor, tried to reflect on l'homme noir, on the black man, with a specific psychological and mental characteristics. To Senghor, there is a black man, the Senghor of the 1930s, with a specific connection to nature and other human beings, far, as he says, from the rationality and utilitarian mind of the white man. Senghor has often been accused later of essentialism, of course, of believing in the existence of races as distinct entities, which is overstating, of course. By contrast, the second approach, embodied by Césaire, defines more blackness as a historical and social experience. Césaire writes, I quote him, in fact, Négritude is not a biological notion. It refers to something deeper, a sum of experiences which came to define and characterize a form of humanity as history made it. Négritude is a historical form of the human condition, yet we do constitute a community of oppression, of exclusion, a community of discrimination. Of course, also a community of resistance, of continued fight for freedom and hope, end quote. This is in the Discours sur la Négritude. However, the creation of département, the overseas département in 1946, followed by the decolonization process in Africa, led to the decline of Négritude. The great days of the Négritude movement ended in the late 1950s, early 60s, following the Congress of Black writers and intellectuals in Paris in 1956, 60 years ago, almost exactly 60 years ago. African intellectuals came back to their native countries while Caribbean writers started to a new generation of Caribbean writers, I'm thinking of the Creole writers such as Edouard Glissant, of course, started to emphasize the Caribbean part of their culture, the Creole part, by contrast with the transatlantic dimension of Négritude. Césaire, at that time in the 1960s in Martinique, came under very heavy critics. He was called the Roi Césaire, King Césaire, as a way to criticize his fairly authoritarian style of politics. He was a mayor for the France and député of Martinique, and he was also extremely powerful in the literary field of his island, not so much of France. Meanwhile, in metropolitan France, the associative movement split in two. On one side, African workers created their organization on a national basis, the Union of Senegalese Workers, the Union of Workers from Mali, etc., while the Caribbean civil servants and workers had their own organizations, often linked to trade unions. Political movements, such as that of the African workers in the 1970s, who fought for the control of their residence, their housing, or the movement in support of undocumented workers in the 1990s, were centered more around an African subjectivity rather than a black subjectivity. Africans and Caribbeans in France often thought that their experiences were so particular and different that there was no need to build common perspectives on the foundation of a common racial experience in France. So we had this movement of the Négritude when blackness is definitely thought and discussed through many publications. I'm thinking of Présence Africaine, for example, the journal that started in 1947, and then this decline in the 60s and 70s, also in the 1980s. The situation, I think, started to change in the late 1990s, early 2000. The main reason is that a new generation of French, African, and Caribbean started to protest first against their invisibility on French TV before the uprisings of 2005, which brought to the forefront issues long underestimated in France, particularly the discriminations on the job market and the relationship with the police. I also think that in the late 1990s, this is also the time when internet starts to be really strong. So there's also this acceleration of communication and exchange of ideas with the United States, with a number of people coming back from the United States and having knowledge of how things could be done, how issues were discussed in the United States, as well as in Great Britain, for example. I have several friends who spent a year or two in Great Britain, where they read such authors as Paul Gilroy, for example, why there is no black in the Union Jack. All these discussions that took place in the UK, in the United States, started to have some influence on this new generation of young professionals, young academics, such as myself. This is in the early 2000s when, as an academic, I started to work on these issues. Raised in a very French Republican environment, I never thought of racial issues until I started to live in the United States in the 1990s. But then when I came back to France after years in Philadelphia, my understanding of the French society had been very much changed. So in a way, I was Americanized, which does not mean that I was not looking at the reality of a French society, but for example, the issue of French TV being all white struck me when I came back from the United States, whereas when I was a young student, I never thought of that, right? It started to be a question. This simple fact started to be an anomaly, if you want, possibly a democratic anomaly. So, to get back to my original question, what do we mean when we speak of French blacks? My conclusion, so to speak, is that there is no clear set of beliefs, of values, behaviors, practices which could be associated in France to blackness. It is certainly possible to analyze various forms of black sociability, for example, among the young people in large cities such as Paris, often related to, for example, sport, street basketball, music, with big connections with the United States. There are indeed black subcultures in France. I'm also thinking of religion, with a steep rise of evangelical churches in the suburbs of Paris. It needs to be studied by anthropologists. However, the interviews I conducted with persons, black persons, I'll get back to that in a minute, do not suggest the existence of a strong black community in France, but rather a loose transnational connection with other blacks associated with a strong sense of being French. People insist very much on the fact that, yes, they are French citizens. The Caribbean insists very much on the fact that that their families and their ancestors have been French citizens since 1848, since the abolition of slavery, that is earlier than the people from Nice or from Savoie, as a way to insist on their citizenship. It's also a way to protect themselves from the accusation sometimes, or from the understanding that they are not French. As I was saying earlier, the question that these people often have to answer, if not always, is the question, where do you come from? And if they say, well, I come from Paris, or I come from Lille, then people say, where do you really come from? As if there was a contradiction between blackness and Frenchness, as if the fact of blackness meant something in France, first and foremost, the fact that you are not from here, that you are in some ways a foreigner. So, following this inquiry, this field work, from a social science perspective, the best answer I came to provide, and it may sound a little simplistic, but this is the best answer I can provide at that point, is that blacks in France have in common to live in a society where they are considered as such. Indeed, being black in France is not so much a matter of a common, deep, thick culture, thick blackness, as we may say, but an experience built through social interactions. In a French society where blacks represent a minority share of the population, a black person is a person considered as such by others in many social situations. To give you one example, when arriving in the metropole at the end of World War II, Frantz Fanon realized that, yes, he was considered as a black man, much to his surprise, as he tells in Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, black skin, white mask, a cab driver held him in the street, et le noir. So he looks around, trying to figure out whom the driver is talking to. He thinks, and then he realizes that the driver is talking to him. He's a young student entering the School of Medicine in Lyon. So he writes, this is what Fanon writes, the Antillais, the Caribbean, doesn't think of himself as a black. He thinks of himself as an Antillais. Blacks live in Africa. Subjectively, intellectually, the Antillais behaves as a white man. He realizes that he's black once in Europe, and when hearing about blacks, he knows that he's concerned as much as a Senegalese, end quote. I interviewed many Caribbean people who often dismiss the legitimacy of color distinctions. They think of themselves as Frenchmen, colorblind, etc., while in the same time acknowledging that most often, yes, they are considered as black persons, for example, in various interactions with various French institutions. For example, to give you one example, when I had to renew my passport last year, my French passport, so I went to the mairie of my arrondissement in Paris, and the woman when processing my my administrative phone, she started to speak to me in a very slow French. Voila, you have to write here, as if I was not able, and my French was a standard French. I don't have any accent. But she thought that I had to, to process what she was saying, and this is something that. This kind of anecdote is or anecdotes I can also share, because I have this personal experience of being seen as a foreign man, but also being seen as someone who doesn't master the intricacies and sophistication of the French language. That is why often many French black intellectuals have chosen to focus on academic specialties which are at the heart of French culture. It is no coincidence if Senghor became the first agrégé de grammaire, that's the high diploma in the French academia in grammar, French grammar. He chose to specialize in that. That is, he chose to precisely to focus on the very element that was always questioned in his years during his years in Paris. He arrived in Paris in 1928. Césaire himself chose to specialize in Latin and Greek, right, in the hyper-center of the French classic culture. So for persons usually considered as black, there is little room for choice. You cannot simply decide not to be black in France. In France, being white is not a matter of thoughts. Indeed, whiteness has been thought as a universal standard, which means that the Europeans do not consider whiteness as a meaningful social factor, by contrast with blackness. Sociological investigation as well as historical inquiry suggest that if there is no black community in France understood as a group with a well-defined identity, there is nevertheless a lowest common denominator, the social experience of blackness. This social experience is, of course, linked to the historical construction of the black race since the 17th century. The forms of domination have varied in time and in space. The situation in the United States, where slavery existed on the national soil, is different from that of France, where colonization existed overseas, far from the real France. So that it created this kind of gap in their understanding of blackness as being foreign to the real France. However, it is clear that in spite of the end of institutional forms of domination in the United States and in France with the end of segregation and the end of colonization, blackness has remained a powerful stigma in French and American societies. The experience of racial discrimination is not identical for every black person. Gender interacts with race, often to reinforce discriminatory processes, rarely to mitigate them. Black women are situated at the intersection of racial and gender domination, and they have original experiences and interests. Class does also matter. A black worker tends to experience harsher forms of racism than a black professional when dealing with the institutions such as the police or the judicial. However, numerous studies related to the US situation suggest that job discrimination can be higher in the higher ranks of the social and professional ladder. Now, what are the reasons why, and I will soon end, what are the reasons why French society and the French social sciences have too often neglected racial issues and failed to acknowledge the specific issues related to French blacks? The first reason, I think, is the lack of quantitative information related to persons of African descent in France. Obviously, the racial discrimination instituted by the Vichy regime have traumatized the French, who remain deeply suspicious of any form of ethnic and racial categorization. This reluctance is understandable, but one should keep in mind that the notion of race in the social sciences and in public policies does not imply that races have any ontological or biological reality, but that they have an imaginary existence with some social effects. the lack of ethno-racial statistics in France has clearly contributed to the invisibility of problems, by contrast with the US or Great Britain, and the difficulty to legitimize these problems, which are too often dismissed as mere exceptions to the common rule. Another problem is the centrality of the social question in the French social science, understood as the class question. The social question, la question sociale, which started in the late 19th century with the growth of the working class in France, analyzing society through class lenses has created research priorities, that is, class relations between workers and the bourgeoisie, has favored historical agents, the workers, and the study of social movements led by political organizations and the union trade. The history of immigration, for example, has tended to emphasize class status over racial disparities, so that many historians of immigration have assimilated non-European immigration to earlier patterns of regional and European migrations, failing to take into account what non-European migrants themselves have been saying. If you want a good example of that, you can read the conversation between Pierre Bourdieu and Abdelmalek Sayad, when Sayad, the Algerian-born sociologist, tries to convince Bourdieu that Algerian migrants have specific problems in France, which are not only class problems or regional problems. And then Bourdieu says, oh yeah, it's just like me as a migrant coming from southwestern France, from Béarn, when arriving in Paris. Bourdieu fails to understand the specificity of the post-colonial experience, which he assimilates to general patterns of regional migration within France. By doing so, the French researchers have too often neglected the existence of agents addressing problems not directly relevant to class struggle. In this perspective, the minorities have not only been neglected, but also suspected of encouraging the demobilization and the collapse of the working class. The same was true for too long with women. For too long, when it comes to women, there's specificities and their political demands were dubbed as a smokescreen hiding the reality of class domination. Fortunately, times have been changing and feminist studies have become a fairly legitimized field of research in France. I believe that the time has come, more than come, to undertake the same effort for minorities in the French social sciences. In fact, following more established tradition in the United States and Britain, there exists now in France a number of young sociologists and historians trying to legitimize and demarginalize minority studies. In order to do so, we have to break with the, let's say, question sociale tradition, as well as in anthropology, the radical deconstruction of identities, which many French anthropologists have engaged in for 30 years. Last but not least, the relative historical weakness of black organizations in France can be attributed to the difficulties to legitimize problems of discriminations, which can be evaluated with statistical tools. In the United States, the rise of black studies, African American studies, is clearly linked to the civil rights movement. Social and political movements have had clear effects onto social research. Whereas in the French case, the marginality of black studies can also be attributed to a lack of political mobilization and to the series of defeats which anti-racism has experienced since the early 1980s. Shall we speak now of a new Négritude in France? My answer would be a prudent yes, provided that the Négritude be understood in social ways. This is not to dismiss the early Senghor, whose analyses were precious at a time of brutal racism based on races as fundamental biological categories. But clearly, the contemporary need to fight discrimination and racism in France seems, I think, to bypass the forms of strategic essentialism by focusing on historical and social experiences, that is, on identities understood in purely social terms. These political and intellectual developments can help understand that black studies, or some people say now Afro-European studies, can survive the well-known critique of ethno-racial essentialism, which we always have to answer in France. It can be sustained despite the loss of race as a legitimate biological concept, of course. It can flourish despite the diversity of black populations in France. I think that it is about, in the French public arena, in the academia, about the slow, struggling emergence of a minority, of a fait minoritaire, of minority situations, aiming at addressing problems and difficulties which are not essentially different. They are different, but they are not essentially different from that of the United States. It is about deconstructing the French exceptionalism and its unique republicanism, which is supposed to protect us against the evils of racism and racial domination. The political organization of minorities should therefore be seen, I think, in a pragmatic sense, as a self-defense against some of the most burdensome kinds of racial injustice, with the ultimate objective of de-racializing French society, so that skin color does not matter more than eye color or hair color, which does not mean that the rich and precious cultures, Afro-Caribbean cultures that are spreading in France, do not need to be encouraged. It is possible to ask for invisibility, as I said, on one side, and visibility on the other side. Black collective action, the rise of organizations, struggling organizations, trying to redefine the different ways to fight racism in France, can be seen as a contribution to this political process and to the democratization of French society and French political life. Thank you.
We have a lot of questions about Trump. But we'll start in Chicago and then we'll move around the Midwest.
I just want to put a plug in for the film Agents of Change, which I don't know if you've been able to see, but it's actually playing tomorrow night, 6 p.m. at Gene Siskel. And it's a documentary about the people who advocated for Black Studies programs in the United States. So if you're here tomorrow, it's called Agents of Change.
Thank you. So this took place, I guess, in the 1970s for the most part, 1980s, well, 1970s.
Yeah, it was on the campus, some campus starting in the 60s. Rumor has it. One observation request. We are trying to get through a number of questions today, so try to keep your questions fairly brief and concise as possible, if you please.
Thank you. What would you say is the role and the banlieue as a space for the possible construction of blackness or even general non-whiteness in France, and if there's a spatial dimension to that identity?
Yes, there is obviously a spatial dimension since non-white populations tend to live in, let's say, working class suburbs surrounding major cities such as Lyon and Paris, to name only the cities. Also pockets, popular neighborhoods within cities such as La Goutte d'Or, a popular neighborhood in Paris. This, in fact, has created several layers of self-identification. The identification of being de la banlieue, of being from the suburbs, as opposed to people being within city limits, which could be seen as an identification based on where we live, the kind of leisure we have, but also the lack of access to a number of services
which are most available to people living within city limits. So there's this identification of being from la banlieue. There's also this identification of being non-white. Sometimes people say, nous ne sommes pas français, we're not French. They speak of white people as the French, which does not mean that they don't feel French. It's a very ambiguous and nuanced understanding of Frenchness, but here Frenchness equals to whiteness. And last but not least, there is this identification to blackness, which is a way to differentiate themselves from their friends, from their colleagues, etc., who live in the same area, who may be of North African origin. There's also this sense of being from another, of having another story, so to speak, of being from another part of the world with specificities. So I don't think it is those different layers of identification are in contradiction. They are layers that have very that move from one day to another according to the kind of social interaction. You can be a black person with some people, or you can be considered as a black person by the police, but you can be from the banlieue with your friends, within your family. You become more French African, for example, if you speak some African language. All these layers, of course, do exist, but you're right in saying that la banlieue is seen perhaps more and more as a place of, with a certain sense both of pride of being from a specific place, but also an acute sense of the difficulties which people from la banlieue have to face. The notion of ghetto, for example, came to be fairly popular in the French language. People have the sense to be in a ghetto, even if some social scientists dispute the notion of ghetto. This is a long argument that a lot of people have been having in France when discussing the legitimacy of the notion of ghetto. What I'm just saying here is that the people from la banlieue speak of their own situation. We say, nous sommes dans le ghetto, we're in the ghetto. So there's this sense of being in a kind of enclosed environment with the difficulties when accessing to public services, but also major difficulties when using the public transportation. The fact is that you may live in the banlieue, but it's far from Paris in terms of time.
So I have three questions, one from Wayne State in Detroit, one from Grand Valley University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and one from Kansas City and the University of Kansas, all related in various ways to the question of the election of Donald Trump in the United States. One version is, which I think apropos of the comments you were making, given the Brexit and the recent election of Donald Trump, two highly fueled elections by nationalist and often racist discourse, what do you foresee in France? Is Marine Le Pen a real threat? How has the discourse in America's society affected the treatment of minorities in France?
Obviously, Trump's election has been applauded by extreme right organizations throughout Europe, including Marine Le Pen and the National Front. She was one of the first European leaders to send a message to say how much she is happy of Trump's victory. This is really good news to her because she sees that following the Brexit as a very positive sign toward her own path to the French presidency. If Trump has been elected in the United States, then it is very possible, as she sees it, and as many people see it, it is very, very possible that Marine Le Pen could be elected to the presidency. So clearly, the election of Trump is fantastic news for the National Front. They are just so happy. They are so. It's a surprise, divine surprise. It's they didn't expect that. No one expected. So it came out of the blue on Wednesday morning. And they have been rejoicing since, because they really believe that, yes, Trump's election is another step towards the possibility of an extreme right government in France. Yes. It is a real, and when I said that, I tell myself, are you listening what you are telling? But but yes,
Yeah.
because Trump is president of the United States.
We have another 2 months to figure it out.
Thank you. I was watching news clips of the evacuation of like jungle near Calais, and it struck me that the buses that were sent to move the people from there, the seats were covered with plastic. And it reminded me of grandmothers that cover the furniture with plastic because they don't want the children, the grandchildren to mess them up. What was the reaction of the French to this particular symbolic act? Because the buses were not particularly new. But the seats were covered with plastic. And the other thing another question I would like to ask is, when I come to France, I'm also struck by how often I see people of African descent speaking African languages. And if you are familiar with Black Africa, you can tell where the people are from, regardless of what they are wearing. And I wonder whether French citizens of European descent are annoyed by the presence of these foreign languages in their territory.
The first point is really, I didn't notice that the seats were covered with plastics. I don't know, you are a very acute observer. Obviously, I admire how microscopic your vision of TV is. That's quite something. No, but more seriously, to me, it fits very well into this classic pattern which has very much existed in the United States. The idea that migrants carry germs, right? That they carry disease, that they are dirty. This is something which, if you read, classic studies by Alan Kraut, for example, when it comes to immigrants to the United States, you really see how there's migrants in Ellis Island, for example, were seen as carrying disease, or Nayan Shah concerning the Chinese migrants to California, and how Chinatown was understood as a place that was a potential danger to carry a disease. So to me, it's very much part of a century-long discourse connecting migrants to germs and disease, and it may sometimes take ludicrous forms when it comes to the seeds and the plastic. When it comes to language, it is also important, I think, to reflect on the importance of the French language, right? Frenchness is also very much associated with the language. There's an official language in France with standard forms that were implemented by the French Republic in the late 19th century, when regional languages were suppressed, when the idea was to create a strong republic with a universal language within the republic. This was the French language. So this reminds me something I have paid close attention to, which is the invention of Pidgin French in the early 20th century, the kind of French that was spoken by African soldiers at that time. Many people think that this Pidgin French was the kind of natural French spoken by these soldiers during the war, for example. In fact, it was not the case. Pidgin French was an invention by French linguists by French academics because it was believed that the Africans could not master the sophisticated French language, so that this language had to be simplified in order to be learned by the French soldiers. So the fact that these French soldiers tried to reclaim the language in its full sophistication, just like Senghor in many ways in the interwar period, goes with the another kind of fight or another kind of tension, that is the possibility to use your own language within the French arena. This is not encouraged at all, as you may know. You're supposed to speak French. You can speak English, that's fine usually, right? Because you're a tourist.
Not always.
You can speak German, not always, historically speaking, I guess. So the foreign languages have different weight, of course, but African languages are seen, of course, as suspect because people who speak African languages are not tourists, they are migrants, and an African migrant is always suspect of being undocumented or of various illegal activities.
I have a question for many activists. You have spoken of how class is sometimes preempted race in France. Can you compare that with the U.S.? And the second part of the question is the pattern of blacks living in the banlieues, as in Paris, replicated in all French cities.
Living in the banlieue is what?
Is the pattern you see, the spatial patterns you see in Paris,
Yeah.
you see that in Lyon,
Right.
Lyon, Bordeaux?
Is it the case in elsewhere?
Yeah.
In France, I would say so, although it is rather clear that the black population in France is heavily concentrated in the largest metropolitan centers, such as Paris, such as Lyon, Marseille, and Lille. With these 4 cities, and Bordeaux possibly on a lesser scale, you have a large majority of this population. The Caribbean population, for example, is heavily concentrated in the Paris area. The Paris area, which is the Île-de-France, that's the official name for the Paris area, has also been called the 4th island of the Caribbean. And then you have the 4th island. It speaks volume about how this population came to be concentrated, not because people like to be in Paris, because of an effort by the French state to concentrate this population so as this population would work in specific fields and so on and so forth. The first question.
You have spoken how class is sometimes
Yeah, class.
race.
Sure. I mean, and this is a debate that American scholars have had for the longest time, for decades and decades. The intricacies between race and class. And as I was saying earlier, the French sociologists and historians are used to class as a legitimate category. What many people are arguing is that we should integrate race as a meaningful factor, as a legitimate factor when analyzing the production of inequalities in France. Inequalities are not always produced by the capitalist system, and when the capitalist system produces inequalities, these inequalities are not only class inequalities. Race and class are intimately linked, and this is the object of the social science inquiry to figure it out. In some circumstances, class does matter more than race. It is very true also in this country, in the United States. In other circumstances, that's the other way around. But there is no general rule. It depends on the very kind of social interaction you study, on the very city, on the very people you study. There is no general rule. The conclusion, this is not an introduction, this is the conclusion of the inquiry to figure it out.
Black Lives Matter a few times tonight, and also during the lunch lecture. And one thing I think is interesting, I recall C.L.R. James' book, The History of Pan-African Revolt, where he kind of walks through the revolt on the continent of Africa, and the history of slave revolts. I spent some time in South Africa over the summer, and one thing that struck me was the Fees Must Fall movement. In many ways, it's a contemporary of Black Lives Matter in the United States, but that the issue that sparked this movement, revolution, some would want to call it, is a completely different issue. It's not police brutality, although there's definitely instances of police brutality in South Africa. It was the hiking of fees, tuition fees for students. In the past year, it's now encompassed broader issues of race and post-apartheid South Africa, and issues of belonging and access to resources and things of the sort. So has France, at least Black France, had their watershed moment, something that's similar to Fees Must Fall, the hiking of fees in South Africa, the killing of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown in America? Could the issue behind this very loose organization of forces and activism be due to the fact that there hasn't been something, maybe country-specific that has really woken people up?
I think that there has been a watershed moment, and again, this is the 2005 uprisings, 11 years ago, in November of 2005, when when two teenagers, actually, they were in their early teens, died in an electric plant in the suburbs of Paris because they were chased by the police. The police was after them. The police saw that they entered this electric plant, and instead of calling the electric utility to ask to shut down the electric plant, they let them within the electric plant, and of course they got electrocuted and they died. This was an incredibly important moment, and if you travel in the suburbs of Paris, you will see the faces of these two young people on the walls, right? And the memory of their names is still very powerful. The judicial and the administrative inquiry has dragged for years and years and years and years, with families waiting, asking for information, etc., which the police didn't want to provide. I mean, it's a very, very long process that has played, I think, a central role. Some people speak of a 2005 generation with young people who started to do things when they had no idea, when they didn't want or didn't think about it before 2005. So I think that this is definitely an important moment. But as I said earlier, what is missing, what has been missing in France, is not so much this kind of moment with people asking for the truth, with people asking for justice. They're not asking for more than that. It is that these people, as well as an earlier generation, has experienced defeat after defeat into the anti-racist movement. There is no memory of victory. There is no great moment, even in a kind of fantasized way. There is no great historical moment that would be a moment of victory. Unlike the United States. I'm not saying that the situation is good in the United States, far from it, but at least you have this memory in the United States of important moments in the 1960s, of the struggles. You have larger-than-life figures to think about. The young people have larger-than-life figures to think about. In France, we don't have that. We don't have the kind of powerful an association that, yes, anti-racism can be effective. It can be powerful. In France, there's this sense that it's not going anywhere. There's this sense of defeat, right, which doesn't help when organizing or reorganizing the anti-racist movement in this country.
So I have a question from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Are there any categories of laws in France that mention blackness or race specifically in an effort to guarantee equality?
The notion of race is mentioned in the French Constitution when the Constitution says that citizens should not be separated on any basis
including race. But this mention of race, it's mentioned only once in the French Constitution, has been a matter of political debate for some years. With, for example, François Hollande, when elected president, this was one of his point in his political campaign. He said, "Oh, race does not exist, so we should erase race from the French Constitution, right? Because why should it be in the French Constitution?" Many people said it's a very. I told François Hollande, I remember, I said it's a very bad idea, because if race is in the Constitution, it's not because race do it. It is that's the only anti-racist statement in the French Constitution. So if you erase race, there is no anti-racist statement in the French Constitution. So if you want to have a strong anti-racist statement, you've got to mention race as an imaginary category. So it's stupid to erase the notion of race, thinking that racism will evaporate. It is stupid, I think. Race should be in the French Constitution. So you see that that's the legal understanding. But again, I would say that, especially in the left, most people, I haven't seen any polls, but I would guess that most people would be in favor of erasing race. There's this idea that the purification of the Constitution will have positive effects onto society, which is, I think, a very naive understanding of race as a foundation of social interaction in France.
But that's not a viewpoint that's exclusive to France. I've had colleagues in Black Studies departments at a university on the East Coast in a place called Cambridge who would argue that if we start using racial categories, racism will disappear.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. No, this is something that is, but it's especially strong in France because prominent politicians have advocated that as a part of their political program. But Hollande hasn't done anything about that. Which I'm glad. I think he hasn't done much, but when he does other things, we should applaud him.
Hi. I taught English at a school in Saint-Paul-sur-Mer, and right next to Dawson, and it was my second year there, and I mean, in terms of that environment, and I come into school and I see Pole National and spray paint right next to the school. Are there efforts made that are being made to really try and win that over? I mean, there's such a feeling there that even I didn't really feel welcome there as just being a foreigner. But are there efforts being made just to maybe avoid the situation that has happened here just now, or? I'm curious to hear if there's really a plan in terms of welcoming people
I think that the French, as well as the American civil societies, have strong democratic resources. That the migrants, for example, that have come to France have not been welcomed by the French state or with a lot of distance, but they have been welcomed by the French population, with people organizing, with people helping, with people providing shelter, offering courses in French, and so on and so forth. So I've really been very much impressed by the reaction of significant parts of the French society. I'm not saying the whole society, but significant parts of the French society. So that makes me optimistic. Now, I'm also completely aware that this will not be sufficient when fighting the National Front in a few months, when the National Front will start. It's powerful, and it's going to be a very powerful campaign a la Trump in many ways. So the point remains to figure out what to do. We were discussing earlier about how the academia could be involved into the crucial times we're getting through. Should we stay in the university, teach and do our duties, or should we do something else? And what should we do? How do we connect? How do we help? What kind of is knowledge? Are the social sciences useful when addressing a number of pressing issues and fighting the forms of populism that are spreading in France as well as in the United States. This is an urgent question. This is so urgent, I think, that we should all, in fact, start to organize, speak, do things, possibly in a kind of a transnational perspective, since we have to face similar issues. But you're right. I mean, this is a very, very serious question, and that keeps me awake at night. That's the only thing I can say. I cannot sleep because of that.
I haven't gone to this side of the room yet.
Very close to you now, please.
Yes, I have two questions.
My first question is, as a francophone non-French, I've always noticed when I watch TV Saint Monde that if I were to close my eyes, and I would not know the difference when a black person or a non-black person is talking. But when I'm watching the news in America, if I close my eyes, I'll be able to make the difference. And I was wondering, is it the people they hire, or is it subtle that because I'm not French I can see it, or is there such a thing as a distinct black accent in French? The second question, what do we mean by black in France? Because here in the US, from what I understand, if you have one drop of black, you are black. And I come from a country where you are Haitian regardless of the color of your skin. It's because once you speak Creole, you're Haitian, or no matter the color of your skin. But if you don't speak Creole, you're blanc. You're a white person. So what is black? What is black in France? And what is black in France? And then deuxième question, is there a subtle accent, or is it not?
Well, this is what I tried to answer earlier in my talk. Sorry. This is all about trying to say what does blackness mean in France. The best answer I came to provide is that a black person is a person seen as such by others in French society. Which does not mean that the black person sees himself or herself as black, right? This is how people look at this person. When it comes to accents, well, the only thing I can say is that there are many African accents, for example. Africans may speak French with an accent, which is often seen as African, but there are many differences. Senegalese and the Congolese do not speak French with the same accent, obviously, and if your ear is trained to that, you can tell. Martinique and a person from the Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean do not speak French with the same accent. They have an accent. And yet, what is also important, so there are accents throughout French ways, many French Creoles, many ways to speak French throughout the world, obviously. But what is also important to take into account is the political weight of a standard French, which does not exist to the same extent in the United States, because in the United States, English does not have the same kind of status as the French language, which was seen as a political tool by the French state, so as to reinforce the nation and avoid any kind of regional identities that was seen as threatening the emerging republic. So what is absolutely crucial is how the standard French has been implemented, and how the TV, for example, you mentioned the TV, for the longest time was the place where a standard French would be aired with the suppression of regional accents. Regional accents were not allowed on French TV. So you had this so-called French standard, the language spoken in Paris and the most central parts of France. But this understanding of the French language has been more flexible for 30 years, with the renewal of regional languages, with the possibility to teach in regional languages in France, etc. So things are a little are calming down, so in a way, with a less a rigid way to understand the language. But I come from a generation where the teaching of the French language was seen as the single most important way to become a French citizen.
I have another question from Wayne State in Detroit, Michigan. How do you see the relationship between religion and race in France? For example, surrounding the laws around headscarves.
Yeah. What has struck me, and when you speak of the religion of Islam, has been very much at the center of discussions, political discussions in France. What has struck me is the racialization of Islam, meaning that Islam has been understood as closely associated to the North Africans. To a French person, an Arab is a Muslim is an Arab. That's as simple as that. So here we have to understand the history of the Arab race, the racialization of North African persons, especially starting when the French arrived in Algeria in 1830, as something that has incorporated Islam as a central component on the understanding of this race, the North African race. By contrast with the sub-Saharan blacks, who for many of them were and are Muslims, but they are not seen as Muslims as such by the French. So to me, Islam has been very much integrated into the racial understanding of the French Empire, but also of the French post-colonial societies.
And very patient.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. So you mentioned that there are some politicians that are trying to eliminate the word race from the Constitution. Like in the other side of the spectrum, are there any politicians competing for these elections, like with concrete policies of affirmative action or things that can integrate the minorities into the French society?
Very few, I'm afraid, and it speaks volume about the political isolation of people fighting racism and discriminations in France. I'm thinking again of François Hollande when running for president in 2012. He incorporated a provision saying that the race profiling by the police should be fought, and he proposed that the police would give récépissé, that is little papers, to the people being controlled who have some foreign experiences, suggesting that when the policeman each time has to write a little paper, he pays more attention to the reasons why he tends to focus on this person rather than this person. It does not solve all problems, but it's an interesting experience. But as soon as he was elected, François Hollande swept that on the side, and he's never talked about that anymore because the trade union, the police, etc., was adamant that he was very much opposed to that. So I think that François Hollande had a very tactical understanding of anti-discriminatory policies. He included that so as to attract the vote of minorities, which he needed to be elected president in many ways, but he discarded that as soon as he was elected. So now we are in a situation where no one, as far as I can tell, except one person running but he's not a prominent politician in France. I'm thinking of Benoît Hamon, but practically no one has incorporated these issues into the agenda. So what I'm hoping, and I'm discussing with a number of people in France, is that these issues be incorporated in the national conversation during the presidential campaign. We need to have people who talk about that. For now, I'm afraid that the whole question of anti-racism and discriminations will be swept under the rug, with people only focusing on the migrants, Islam as a problem, denouncing communautarism, that is the fact that people of the same origin tend to live together, as a real threat, and ignoring the difficulties which these people have to face. But this is an uphill battle given the political climate we're in France.
Yes, Paul. I was struck in your talk about the fact that you knew that you lived in the States for a while. It was upon your return that it seems like your sense of blackness emerged. And so what was it about your upbringing in France prior to coming to the States, where maybe you did not have that similar sense of blackness, of being different, and your experiences here in the U.S., that now upon your return to France made that change?
Yes, it's exactly that. I was raised in a very middle-class French white environment, since I and my sister were raised by my mother. My father lived in Senegal, so we lived in a very white environment with white friends, cousins, etc., etc., etc. The issue of blackness was not, I think that my mother tried to protect us in a way by not insisting on that, although she insisted on the African heritage, but the skin color was not mentioned, and I didn't see myself as a black person. I saw myself in a kind of French style, French citizen, a student, etc., etc. So yes, I think that living in the United States was a tremendous experience for me. It was a way to not to only to think of blackness as a problem, but to think of blackness as a source of pride, maybe something like that, as something I didn't have to be ashamed of, as something something that shouldn't be an object of shame or some kind of or as if it was some kind of problem or something I had to not to speak of. So in fact there was a single moment, if you want, to give you a very personal anecdote. When I arrived as a grad student at the University of Virginia, I received an invitation to come to a meeting by the BSA, Black Student Alliance. I received this invitation, and I was shocked. What? Why? You know, I'm French, I'm a grad student, etc., etc. It was really shocking to my very French understanding of myself, in a way. And then I went to this meeting, by curiosity, I guess. I wanted to figure out what was going on, and then I had a very interesting conversation with the people, and I went several times to the BSA meeting. So this was, I relaxed a bit. Okay, it's okay to be black, it's okay. It's okay, and you can even speak with other black persons. It's okay. It's not something you should avoid at all costs. So yes, this was really important to me and to many people who have spent time in the United States. But again, it is not when coming back to France, and I think that when I came back to France, the situation in France was then quite different from what it is now. We have seen quite a few changes in French society for 15 years, and without saying that France is becoming a more multicultural society, in some ways it is becoming a more multicultural society. This is an interesting development. I would end by saying just that what was seen as normal in the 1990s, when I was a student, what was seen as obvious, all TV journalists are white, all French politicians are white, all the French economic elites, they are all white, etc. And this was not a problem. This was seen as normal because whiteness was the universal standard. Why would you criticize the universal standard? This understanding of French society is now different because thanks to many developments, including the election of Barack Obama, which was so important in France, it was so intensely commented, this election in 2008, because the French started to think, oh, in fact, what is normal, what we see as normal, is an anomaly, is a problem, is something that should be addressed. So we've moved from a situation when normalcy became a democratic problem. That's a progress, I should say, even if there is so much to do, even if, as I said, the very organization of a strong anti-racist movement is still something that that is a major intellectual and political challenge in France.
Thank you very much.